There is a space we all inhabit, a space we assume is governed by the unspoken rules of polite society. The workplace, the quiet grocery store aisle, the fluorescent lit office. We clock in, we make small talk, we clock out. We assume the people sitting in the cubicle next to us, or stocking the shelves a few feet away, are just like us. People living ordinary lives, bound by the same social contracts. But sometimes, the social contract is a fragile illusion. Sometimes, the person smiling at you across the break room isn't operating on the same frequency. Sometimes, they are watching you, studying you, and waiting for the perfect moment to show you exactly who and what they really are. Welcome to today's episode. Settle in, lock your doors, and turn the volume up. We have 3 stories today about the terrifying reality of what happens when the mundane world of work becomes a hunting ground. It is a rite of passage for almost every college student. The summer internship. For our first narrator, a 20-year-old university student, it was supposed to be a stepping stone. She had secured a position at a downtown financial services firm. It was the epitome of corporate monotony, data entry, endless spreadsheets, and 8 hours a day staring at the harsh glare of a computer monitor. But the compensation was fair, and the resume boost was undeniable. The environment was a quintessential open-plan office. The intern's worker held into a cluster of low-walled cubicles. The dividers were just high enough to offer the illusion of personal space, but low enough that true privacy was entirely non-existent. There were 8 interns in total. 5 of them were exactly what you would expect, easygoing, pragmatic college kids who were just there to punch the clock and collect a paycheck. Then there was Eric, a hyper-focused over-veteran who typed with a frantic, aggressive energy, treating every spreadsheet as a matter of life and death. And then, there was the 8th intern. His name was Alex. At a passing glance, Alex appeared to be nothing more than your standard, socially awkward young man. He was exceptionally tall, gaunt, and possessed a pale, almost sickly complexion. A tangled mop of dark, perpetually unwashed hair hung over his forehead. He certainly didn't look the part of an aspiring finance bro, but his appearance wasn't what made the hairs on the back of the narrator's neck stand up. It was his behavior. Specifically, his behavior toward her. It began with microaggressions of personal space. The cubicle walls were low, meaning that when Alex approached her workspace, his towering frame made him appear almost 7 feet tall. He would simply materialize at the edge of her desk. Only his head and shoulders would visible over the gray fabric divider. He would stand there, utterly motionless. Then he would slowly tilt his head to the side, stretch his lips into a rigid, frozen smile, and speak. But it wasn't his normal speaking voice. He would intentionally pitch his tone into a slow, breathless, chillingly deliberate cadence. It was performative, calculated. If you have ever heard the actor Charlie Hunnam portray the notorious serial killer Ed Gein, you know exactly the kind of soft, taunting, dead-eyed voice Alex was using. Are we working hard, Ronnie? Or hardly working? He would drawl, letting the syllables hang in the sterile office air. And then, he wouldn't leave. He would just maintain that rigid, unnatural smile, staring down at her for an agonizingly long time. Initially, she employed the defense mechanism most women are taught to use. She laughed it off. She politely chuckled, assuming he was just trying to be the quirky office clown, overcompensizing for his lack of social grace. But the visits rapidly escalated. It became a daily ritual. Every single shift, she would catch movement in her peripheral vision, only to look up and see Alex's head slowly rising above the partition like a predator cresting a ridge. The conversations he initiated were deeply bizarre. Sometimes they were disjointed jokes devoid of punchlines. Other times, he would simply mutter disconnected phrases that held absolutely no contextual meaning. But the delivery was always the same, that soft, mocking, theatrical serial killer voice. The other interns noticed the dynamic, but they misread the room entirely. They assumed it was an inside joke. They believed Alex had established a strange, comedic rapport with her that the rest of them weren't privy to. They didn't understand that she was being held emotionally hostage. She wasn't his friend. She was his captive audience for a deeply unsettling psychological performance. As the summer dragged on, his loitering worsened. He would lean over her divider and just watch her type for minutes on end. The silence stretching between them was suffocating. She would invent excuses, reports to file, emails to send, praying he would take the hint. He never did. 6 weeks into the summer program, the unease shattered into outright terror. It was a quiet weeknight. The narrator was at home, enjoying a solitary dinner, when her cell phone illuminated. An unknown number flashed on the screen. Ordinarily, she would let it go to voicemail, but she was anticipating a call from a delivery driver, so she swiped to answer. She pressed the phone to her ear and offered a polite greeting. She was met with a heavy, static-laced silence, the kind of silence that feels like it's breathing. Seconds ticked by. What? Then, a voice slithered through the speaker. The tide is rising. Time to pull your boat from the water. It was Alex. He was using the exact same forced, theatrical, chilling tone he used over the cubicle wall, but the volume was amplified. He was practically shouting, dragging out the vowels as if reciting a dark nursery rhyme. Before she could even process the words, he erupted into laughter. It was an unhinged, hysterical, ear-piercing cackle that sounded completely disconnected from human sanity. Then, the line went dead. The blood drained from her face. It wasn't just the cryptic, threatening message that paralyzed her. It was a singular, terrifying fact. She had never given Alex her phone number. With trembling fingers, she typed out a text to the unknown number, demanding to know if it was him. A moment later, her phone chimed with an automated response. Mate. Message not delivered. She ran the digits through a reverse search engine. It was a registered landline. Her mind raced, desperately trying to construct a logical explanation. Did he pilfer the company's emergency contact roster? Did he dig through the HR files? Even if he had, why was he calling her? The sound of his hysterical laughter echoed in her brain. This was no longer an awkward coworker trying to be funny. This was a man deliberately attempting to inject fear into her life. She dreaded walking into the office that following Monday. But when she arrived, her stomach knotted with anxiety. Alex's desk was completely vacant. She immediately sought out her supervisor, a pragmatic manager named Martin. She cautiously inquired if it was possible for an intern to access employee contact directories. Martin furrowed his brow, assuring her that interns were locked out of all sensitive employee data. Mike. Then, Martin delivered the news. Alex had been terminated the previous Friday. He had been neglecting his duties entirely, staring blankly at his screens, and ignoring repeated warnings from management. They had cut him loose. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly eclipsed by a need for disclosure. She confessed the details of the Friday night phone call to her manager. Several nearby interns stopped typing, their heads turning to listen. Suddenly, the dam broke. Other interns chimed in, admitting that Alex had made their skin crawl as well, that his presence was fundamentally disturbing. The supervisor assured her that Alex's building access had been revoked. He was gone. There was no reason to fear him returning. For a week, the narrator remained in a state of hypervigilance, flinching at every phone notification, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But the days ticked by in glorious, uneventful silence. The office returned to its mundane rhythm. She began to exhale. Until the early hours of a Friday morning. It was 5:00 a.m. The world was utterly still, wrapped in the thin, slate gray light of pre-dawn. The narrator was jolted from a deep sleep by a faint noise. It wasn't loud, just a subtle disturbance in the ambient quiet of the house. Driven by an instinct she couldn't suppress, she threw off her blankets, crept across her bedroom floor, and peered through the blinds into her backyard. Her heart stopped dead in her chest. Standing in the damp grass, halfway between the edge of the dark tree line and the weak glow of her porch light, was a silhouette. Even in the poor lighting, the physical geometry was unmistakable. The towering, emaciated frame, the rigid, unnatural posture, the chaotic mess of dark hair. It was Alex. He was standing perfectly still, his face angled upward, staring directly at her bedroom window. For a span of heartbeat, total paralysis gripped her. Her brain simply refused to accept the reality of the image burning into her retinas. Then, cutting through the morning fog, came his voice. He called out her name. It was the office voice. That soft, taunting, theatrical drawl, dragged out into a chilling, sing-song melody that carried across the lawn. Adrenaline finally overrode the shock. She snatched her cell phone from the nightstand, her fingers flying toward the keypad to dial 911. As she did, she looked back out the window. Alex slowly tilted his head back toward the sky and began to laugh. It was the same hysterical, detached, psychotic laughter from the phone call. It echoed through the quiet neighborhood, a sound utterly devoid of mirth or sanity. She slammed her hands against the window glass, screaming at the top of her lungs, threatening him with the police, demanding he get off her property. She practically pressed the glowing screen of her phone against the glass to prove she was dialing the authorities. Alex, laughter slowly died in his throat. He stood motionless for one agonizing second longer. Then, he simply turned on his heel. He didn't run. He didn't rush. He casually strolled back into the dense line of trees behind her property, his shoulders shaking with silent laughter, until the shadows swallowed him whole. The police dispatch arrived swiftly, but by the time the cruiser's spotlight swept the backyard, the tree line was empty. Because he had not made a physical attempt to breach the home, and because his verbalizations weren't explicitly violent threats, the officers' hands were tied. They took a report, advised her to call back if he returned, and drove away, leaving her alone with a terror that would take months to fade. The rest of the summer bled away. Alex never reappeared. The internship concluded, and though her supervisor offered her a lucrative, permanent position at the firm, she politely declined. She couldn't stomach the thought of returning to that building, of walking past that low-walled cubicle ever again. Years have passed. She rationalizes the nightmare now, attributing Alex's rapid descent to an unmedicated mental illness, a severe psychological fracture that transformed an awkward kid into a predator in the dark. But logic offers little comfort when she lies awake at night. The digital footprint we leave behind means that finding an address or a phone number is terrifyingly simple for anyone with the motivation to look. She survived her internship, but she will never, ever forget the image of that gaunt figure standing in the pre-dawn gray, laughing at a punchline that only he could understand. Our second story takes us to the kind of place where people believe bad things simply do not happen. A picturesque, quiet town tucked away in the dense, green mountains of Vermont. The narrator was 17 years old, navigating the thrilling independence of her very first job. She was hired as a cashier at the local, independently owned grocery store. It was a simple, repetitive existence, governed by the rhythmic beeping of barcode scanners and the hum of industrial refrigerators. For a teenager, the job was a social hub. The staff was a tight-knit ecosystem. During the agonizingly slow hours of the afternoon, when the aisles were devoid of customers, the younger employees would gravitate toward the front registers. They would lean against the counters, gossiping about their high-school drama, dissecting the latest television series, and bonding over the shared misery of retail labor. When a laid-back supervisor was on duty, the front of the store felt less like a workplace and more like a hangout spot. But every ecosystem has an outlier. His name was Sean. He was 24 years old, tasked with stocking the dairy coolers in the back of the store. Sean was a ghost in the social machinery of the staff. He was deeply awkward, radiating an energy of someone who had never quite deciphered the rules of human interaction. He wore his hair in that unkempt, in-between length. Not quite short, not quite long enough to reach his shoulders. Because he was confined to the dairy section, the narrator rarely crossed paths with him. Their interactions were limited to polite, obligatory nods when passing in the breaker. Eventually, as is customary in modern workplaces, the teenage staff created a sprawling group text chat to swap shift covers and share memes. Sean, by virtue of being relatively young, was added to the roster. Wait, the narrator didn't give it a second thought, but Sean did. It started with a direct message. A simple, innocuous question regarding the work schedule. Are you picking up any extra shifts this weekend? The narrator, polite and unsuspecting, replied. But Sean didn't let the conversation die. Over the ensuing weeks, his digital presence became a constant, suffocating drip. The inquiry shifted rapidly from professional to uncomfortably personal. He wanted to know what band she listened to with. He wanted to know her exact post-work routines. He demanded granular details about how she spent her days off. At first, the narrator tried to excuse it. She assumed it was just clumsy small talk from a guy who lacked social finesse. What? But then, the tone shifted. He began sprinkling in compliments that made her skin crawl. He would call her cute in ways that felt heavy and laden with expectation. He would deploy awkward, aggressive attempts at flirtation. She was 17. He was a grown man of 24, and she was acutely aware that he was keeping this digital pursuit entirely hidden from their other coworkers. The messages began to arrive late into the night. Wait, they weren't overtly threatening, but they possessed a relentless persistence that triggered her internal alarms. Desperate to avoid a hostile work environment, she adopted the strategy of passive avoidance. She began leaving his messages on read, offering one-word answers, hoping the silence would smother his interest. But ignoring a stalker rarely extinguishes their obsession. It usually just forces them to change tactics. One rainy evening, the narrator was safely barricaded in her bedroom at home, utterly engrossed in the latest season of Stranger Things. She was binge-watching the episodes in absolute privacy, a solitary comfort after a long week of dealing with customers. She didn't post about it online. She didn't text anyone about it. It was her private escape. A few days later, she was back at the grocery store. The afternoon lull had set in, and a group of cashiers had clustered near the front doors, casually debating the merits of various streaming shows. Suddenly, Sean materialized from the aisles. He didn't address the group. He walked directly up to the narrator, his eyes locked onto hers. You like Stranger Things, right? He asked. The ambient noise of the store seemed to drop to a dead silence. The blood froze in her veins. A sickening, icy dread pooled in her stomach. She stared at him, her mind frantically rewinding the last few weeks. Had she worn a t-shirt? Had she mentioned it in passing? She was absolutely certain she had never spoken a word of the show to a single soul in that building. She gave a slow, microscopic nod, incapable of finding her voice. Sean held her gaze for a beat too long, offered a stiff, awkward smile, and then silently pivoted, retreating back to the dairy coolers as if the interaction was entirely normal. She couldn't shake the terror. The realization was a heavy, suffocating blanket. He is watching me. But from where? The answer arrived a few nights later. She was lying in her bed, the lights extinguished, exhaustion pulling at her limbs after a grueling shift. The house was cloaked in the deep, heavy silence of the Vermont woods. Then, A sound cut through the dark. Scrape. It was faint. A soft, abrasive friction against the exterior glass of her bedroom window. She stopped breathing, her eyes wide, staring at the darkened blinds. She desperately tried to rationalize it. Wait, a stray branch. A raccoon. Tap, 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 tap. It was deliberate. It was rhythmic. It was the unmistakable sound of a human fingernail, rapping gently against the pane. Just loud enough to ensure she heard it. Just quiet enough to maintain the terror of uncertainty. She gathered every ounce of courage she possessed, slipped out of her bed, and crept to the window. With trembling fingers, she parted the blinds just a fraction of an inch and peered into the black yard. White. There was nothing. The shadows were empty, but the phantom presence of Sean lingered in the air like a foul odor. The pieces clicked together. He knew what she watched because he had been looking through her window. 2 days later, her phone vibrated. Another message from Sean. The fear had finally crystallized into anger. She was done playing the polite teenager. She typed out a firm, unequivocal rejection, stating clearly and forcefully that she was absolutely not interested in him, and to cease all non-work-related contact immediately. She hit send. The retaliation was instantaneous. Her phone chimed. She looked at the screen, and her heart plummeted. Sean had replied with a single, terrifying sentence. Best of luck changing your home address. It was a mask-off moment. An undeniable, brazen threat that confirmed every single paranoid suspicion she had harbored. He knew where she lived. He had been outside her window, and he was letting her know that rejecting him came with consequences. She didn't hesitate. She immediately took screenshots of the entire digital trail. The next morning, she marched directly into the grocery store manager's office, slammed her phone on the desk, and laid out the entire nightmare. The manager, horrified by the evidence, assured her swift action would be taken. But she didn't stop there. Accompanied by her father, she walked into the local police precinct. She presented the digital threats, recounted the terrifying window tapping, and filed a formal stalking report. The hammer fell quickly. When Sean arrived for his next shift, he was intercepted by management and terminated on the spot. The police served him with a temporary restraining order, legally barring him from coming within a specific radius of the narrator, her home, or her workplace. On paper, the crisis was resolved. In reality, the psychological torture had just begun. A piece of paper signed by a judge does not act as a physical shield against a man unhinged enough to stalk a teenager in the dark. For months, the narrator lived in a state of agonizing hypervigilance. She obsessively checked the deadbolts on every door. She flinched at the sound of the wind. She refused to answer unknown numbers, terrified of hearing his voice on the other end of the line. She became a prisoner of her own paranoia, convinced that every shadow in her yard belonged to the man from the dairy aisle. Gradually, as the seasons changed, the suffocating fear began to loosen its grip. Sean never violated the order. He never appeared in the tree line. The threat, it seemed, had been neutralized by the swift intervention of the authorities. Today, she is an adult. She has relocated to a different town, forged a new career, and severed all ties with that quiet grocery store. But the scar remains. She learned a brutal, invaluable lesson at 17. Predators do not always wear obvious masks. They often camouflage themselves in the mundane. They disguise their obsession as social awkwardness. They test boundaries with innocent questions, waiting to see how much ground you will surrender. If a coworker crosses a line, no matter how subtle, trust your gut. Do not excuse it, because the distance between a harmless text message and a figure tapping on your bedroom window in the dead of night is much shorter than you think. For our final story, we step into a claustrophobic nightmare. A scenario where the elements of nature conspire to trap you in the one place you are supposed to feel secure. The narrator was 26 years old. She was employed at a modest, independent insurance agency in a sleepy suburban pocket of Pennsylvania. The office was an uninspiring architectural afterthought, hidden behind a sprawling strip mall. It was a single, elongated room of identical desks, bathed in the sickly hum of dying fluorescent tubes and permanently smelling of burnt coffee. It was a job of profound boredom, but it paid the bills. It was a Friday afternoon, and the sky above Pennsylvania was turning a bruised, apocalyptic purple. A massive, severe storm system was moving in, dominating the local weather broadcasts. By 3 o'clock, the heavens tore open. The rain didn't just fall. It slammed against the building in heavy, blinding sheets, severely reducing visibility in the parking lot to zero. As the thunder began to violently rattle the thin commercial windows, the agency manager made a judgment call. He dismissed the majority of the staff, allowing them to escape the hazardous roads before the storm peaked. But a massive backlog of client records needed to be physically filed. The narrator, hoping for some overtime pay, volunteered to stay behind and close up the office. Only one other employee volunteered to join her. His name was Tom. Tom had only been hired 2 weeks prior. He was a man in his early 30s, possessing a tall, looming physical presence. But it was his demeanor that set the narrator on edge. He wasn't overtly hostile, nor was he traditionally creepy. He was simply he was completely nonverbal, yet inexplicably omnipresent. If she walked into the break room to brew a pot of coffee, Tom would silently materialize in the doorway 2 minutes later. If she crouched by the copier to restock the paper trays, Tom would appear at the adjacent machine, pantomiming some meaningless task just to be near her. She had previously brushed it off as severe social anxiety, but today, the isolation of the empty office amplified his strange energy. By 5 o'clock, the storm had escalated into a full-blown tempest. Lightning strobed aggressively through the blinds, followed instantly by concussive blasts of thunder that vibrated up through the carpeted floorboards. The narrator sat at her desk, organizing stacks of manila folders. A few rows away, Tom sat at his workstation. He was aggressively typing on his keyboard. But every time the narrator subtly shifted her gaze, she noticed he wasn't looking at his monitor. He was staring directly at her. His fingers were blindly hammering the keys, producing what she could only assume was absolute gibberish on the screen, just to maintain the facade of working while he watched her every move. An hour crawled by. He hadn't broken his gaze. He hadn't moved from his chair. At 6:30, the inevitable happened. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed angrily, flickered twice, and died. The office was plunged into the gloomy, stormy twilight. A second later, the backup generators engaged, casting the long empty room in the sickly, dim orange glow of the emergency lights. The sudden darkness was jarring. The narrator let out a nervous, self-deprecating chuckle to break the tension. Tom did not laugh. He remained perfectly silent. She stood up, declaring that the power outage was a clear sign they should abandon the filing and head home. As she gathered her purse, a sharp, metallic sound echoed from the front of the office. Click, clack. It was the unmistakable sound of a deadbolt sliding into place. She turned around. Tom was standing by the heavy glass front doors. He slipped a ring of keys into his pocket. "It's not safe to go outside right now," he muttered, his voice flat, devoid of any genuine concern. A cold spike of adrenaline pierced her chest. She tried to convince herself he was just being an overprotective, socially inept coworker. But the instinctual alarm bells in her brain were deafening. She forced a tight smile, grabbed her jacket, and stated she was going to call her boyfriend to let him know she was delayed. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket. No service. The storm had completely knocked out the local cellular towers. Suppressing a wave of panic, she quickly walked to the break room and snatched the receiver of the landline off the wall. She pressed it to her area. Dead air. The storm had severed the physical lines as well. She was entirely cut off from the outside world, locked inside a dimly lit building with a man she barely knew. She slowly turned around to head back to the main floor. Tom was standing directly in the doorway. He hadn't made a single sound. He had simply glided across the carpet to block her exit. In his hand, he held a small, powerful LED flashlight. He had the beam angled upward, positioned directly beneath his chin, casting grotesque, elongated shadows across his facial features. And he was smiling. A wide, unnatural, deeply amused smile. The narrator gasped, stumbling backward. She tried to laugh it off, her voice trembling, telling him he had startled her. She asked him, more firmly this time, to unlock the front doors so she could brave the rain and go home. Tom's smile didn't waver. He repeated his mantra. It's better to wait until the worst of it passes, to keep you safe. She realized then that reasoning with him was a futile, dangerous game. She nodded in feigned agreement and quickly brushed past him, retreating to the perceived safety of her cubicle, her mind racing for an escape plan. Minutes later, she peeked over the fabric divider. Tom was gone. But the front lobby was empty. This was her window. She abandoned her jacket, abandoned her purse. She crept down the central aisle, bypassing the locked front doors, and headed straight for the rear emergency exit that led out into the alleyway where her car was parked. She reached the heavy metal door and threw her weight against the crash bar. It didn't budge. She looked down. Wrapped tightly around the door handle and bolted to the frame was a thick, heavy-duty metal chain, secured with an industrial padlock. This wasn't protocol. This was premeditated. He had chained the back door shut from the inside. Before she could process the sheer horror of the trap, the faint, sweeping beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness at the far end of the hallway. Tom was coming. Blind panic took the wheel. She threw open the door to the small janitorial supply closet next to the break room, slipped inside, and pulled the door shut until it clicked softly into the frame. She backed into the darkness, pressing herself flat against a shelving unit, clamping both hands over her mouth to muffle the sound of her own ragged, terrified breathing. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed on the linoleum outside. He was walking down the hall, slowly, methodically. I just want to make sure you're safe, Tom called out. His voice was a sickening mockery of comfort. It echoed in the empty, orange-lit corridor. The footsteps stopped directly outside the closet door. The narrator squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs with such violence she was certain the sound would betray her. A stark white beam of light swept across the bottom gap of the door, illuminating the dust on the floor tiles. The light hovered there for 5 agonizing seconds. Then, the beam vanished. The footsteps slowly receded down the hallway, heading back toward the front of the building. She remained frozen in the dark closet for what felt like an eternity. Every crack of thunder masked the potential sound of his return. But as the minutes ticked by, 10, maybe 15, the silence inside the building remained unbroken. She couldn't stay in the closet forever. She had to make a move. Slowly, agonizingly, she turned the knob and pushed the door open an inch. The hallway was empty. The flashlight beam was gone. She slipped out, hugging the wall, and began a terrifying, silent crawl back toward the main lobby. As she rounded the corner of the last row of cubicles, she stopped dead in her tracks. The front glass doors were completely shattered. Jagged teeth of broken glass hung from the metal frame. The torrential rain and howling wind were blasting directly into the lobby, soaking the industrial carpet. Tom was nowhere to be seen. She didn't question it. She didn't look for him. She bolted. She lodged herself through the shattered frame, sprinting blindly into the blinding rainstorm. She reached her vehicle, her hands shaking so violently, she dropped her keys twice before jamming them into the ignition. She slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning wildly on the wet asphalt, and tore out of the parking lot without ever checking her rearview mirror. She barricaded herself inside her home, locked every deadbolt, and spent the entire night curled on her sofa, wide awake, listening to the rain batter the roof. The following morning, as the storm cleared, she contacted her manager and demanded the police meet them at the office. The authorities arrived to find a scene that defied logical explanation. Tom was gone, but his vehicle was still sitting in the parking lot. It was completely unlocked, resting neatly on the driver's seat were his car keys, his cell phone, and his wallet containing his identification and cash. When the police reviewed the office security system, they made a chilling discovery. The cameras had not been knocked out by the storm. Long before the power ever flickered, Tom had systematically, manually disconnected the video feeds. He had intentionally blinded the building. He had chained the back exit. He had locked the front door. He had planned an atrocity. And then, for reasons known only to him, he shattered the glass and vanished into the storm, leaving his entire life behind on the front seat of his car. He was never seen or heard from again. The narrator submitted her resignation notice a month later. The trauma of being hunted in a claustrophobic, locked environment left a permanent psychological scar. She could never sit at a desk again without obsessively checking the exits. Some of her former co-workers theorized that Tom simply suffered a sudden, severe psychotic break triggered by the atmospheric pressure of the storm. But the narrator knows the truth. Psychotic breaks are chaotic. They are messy. Tom's actions were meticulous. He brought a padlock. He cut the cameras. He waited for the storm. He didn't break down. He was preparing to break, And whatever made him stop and walk out into the rain is a mystery she prays will never, ever be solved. Welcome, listeners, to another descent into the shadows. Settle in, pull your blankets a little tighter, and lock your doors. We all know the night shift, the graveyard hours. It's a time when the rest of the civilized world is tucked away in their beds, dreaming. But for a select few, the security guards, the gig workers, the fast food employees, the hours between midnight and dawn are a stark, waking reality. The night changes things. The air gets colder, the silence gets heavier, and the boundaries between safety and absolute terror begin to blur. Tonight, we are exploring for harrowing tales from the people who keep the world turning while the rest of us sleep. For isolated souls who discovered exactly what, or who, is waiting out there in the dark. Our first story takes us to the greasy, neon-lit perimeter of a late-night drive-through. Tale 1. The Midnight Benefactor. Thomas was 24 years old. Just a regular guy trying to make ends meet. He spent his days playing video games and his nights bathed in the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of a local fast food franchise. For 2 years he had worked the late shift, 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. He considered himself a night owl, so the grueling hours didn't grind him down the way they might break someone else. It was a quiet existence. Unremarkable. Safe. Or so he thought. The descent into paranoia began with an utterly mundane transaction. It was past midnight, and the restaurant was skeleton crude, leaving Thomas completely alone at the drive-through window. A car rolled up to the speaker box. The voice crackling through the cheap intercom was male, flat, and entirely unmemorable. He ordered a large double cheeseburger combo and a soda. Right. When the vehicle pulled up to the first window, Thomas noticed the heavy, pitch-black tint on the windows. The driver only rolled the glass down an inch or two, just enough to push a credit card through the narrow gap. Thomas processed the payment, slid the card and the receipt back into the darkness of the vehicle, and turned to prepare the bags. But when he looked back, the car was gone. The driver hadn't pulled forward to the second window to collect his food. He had simply driven away into the night. Thomas stood there for several minutes, the warm bag of food in his hands, staring out at the empty asphalt, expecting the taillights to circle back around. They never did. Shrugging it off as the bizarre behavior of a late-night wanderer, Thomas eventually set the bag aside and ate the meal himself. 7 days later, the exact same scenario played out. The same flat voice on the intercom. The same heavy burger combo. The same tinted window rolling down just an inch to pay. And, once again, the driver vanished before collecting his food. Thomas chuckled to himself. It was bizarre, sure. But he didn't connect the sinister threads weaving themselves around him. It wasn't until the third identical encounter that the cold reality dawned on him. This was the same man, performing the same inexplicable ritual. Thomas realized something highly unusual was happening, but he chose to look the other way. After all, a stranger was essentially buying him a free, hot dinner every few nights. Wait. This bizarre routine became the rhythm of his late shifts. Every 4 or 5 days, between the desolate hours of 1. Light, 0 and 3. White, ghost in the tinted car, would purchase a meal and vanish. Thomas actually began to anticipate the visits. Then came the night that shattered his reality. It was 2. Light, 0 am. The familiar crackle of the speaker box echoed in the empty restaurant. The flat voice ordered the usual meal. Thomas smiled, already anticipating his free dinner. But then, the voice lingered on the intercom. The static hissed, and the man said something that made the blood freeze in Thomas' veins. I hope you've been enjoying those burgers, Mr. Hurley. Thomas stopped breathing. His last name was Hurley. He did not wear a name tag that displayed his surname. His full name was not printed on receipts, nor was it posted anywhere a customer could possibly see it. There was absolutely no logical way this faceless stranger, sitting in the dark drive-through lane, could know his identity. Panic seized him. Thomas grabbed the headset, stammering, demanding to know who was there. He frantically asked, "Who is this?" over and over into the microphone. Silence. The driver didn't even pull up to the window to pay this time. Thomas heard the deep, guttural rev of an engine, and the car sped off into the night. For the remainder of his shift, Thomas was a prisoner to his own terror. Every shadow outside the window looked like a threat, but the true horror was waiting for him when he finally clocked out and went home. As he approached his front door, he noticed a small piece of paper resting on his welcome mat. It was a handwritten note. The scrawled letters read, "I know what you did. You have 3 days." Thomas felt physically ill. His hands trembled as he stared at the paper. Wait. What had he done? He was a 24-year-old fast food worker who played video games on his days off. He had no dark secrets, no hidden enemies, no underground debts. He spent that entire night sitting rigid on his living room couch, every light in the house blazing, waiting for a monster that never came. But the stalker was merely playing with his food. The very next night, the tinted car returned to the drive-thru. There was no burger order this time. The flat voice simply instructed Thomas to write down an address. It was a remote location on the absolute fringes of the town. Before Thomas could even process the demand, the voice delivered an ultimatum. Thomas had exactly 48 hours to deliver $10,000 in cash to that address. Then, the car peeled away. Thomas was practically vibrating with fear. $10,000. He barely had enough in his checking account to cover rent. He couldn't pay it, and he refused to go to that isolated address. He convinced himself it was an elaborate, cruel prank orchestrated by someone he knew. He decided to ignore the extortion. It was a fatal mistake. 3 agonizing nights passed. Thomas began to let his guard down. He was sitting in his living room, watching television, trying to convince himself the nightmare was over. Suddenly, a deafening crash ruptured the quiet of his home. Glass exploded inward. Thomas threw himself to the floor, his survival instinct screaming that he was under gunfire. He laid there, heart hammering against his ribs, waiting for the next shot. When silence reclaimed the room, he cautiously raised his head. A large, jagged rocks, and amidst a glittering sea of shattered glass, on his living room rug. By the time he peered out the broken window, the street was entirely empty. He finally called the police. He handed over the note, the address, and the terrifying timeline. The authorities investigated the remote drop-off location, but found nothing. They promised extra patrols, but without security camera footage, their hands were illegally tied. Thomas is now trapped in a waking nightmare. He has called out sick from work for days, terrified to leave his home, yet equally terrified to stay inside it. The predator knows where he walks. The predator knows where he sleeps. And Thomas has absolutely no idea why he has been marked for ruin. Tale 2. The Detour. Our next story takes us away from the city lights, out onto the desolate, winding roads that snake through the forgotten outskirts of civilization. The narrator of this tale was a recent college graduate, armed with a communications degree that proved utterly useless in the job market. He moved back in with his parents to scrape together some cash and a shred of dignity. He took up driving for a ride-share app. It wasn't a career, but the late-night weekend shifts, ferrying intoxicated college students home from the downtown bars, provided a decent surge of income. It was a Saturday night, pushing 1:30 a.m. He was exhausted, his eyes gritty from staring at the dark asphalt. He was seconds away from logging off the app when one final ride request pinged. The pickup was downtown, but the drop-off was a brutal distance away, deep past the edge of the suburbs. The fare was lucrative, so, despite his fatigue, he accepted. The passenger was a quiet, unassuming young woman. The 40-minute drive was entirely uneventful, but when he finally dropped her off, it was past 2. Audi found himself completely isolated in the rural darkness. Night. No streetlight, no houses, just dense, looming woods and a long Dr. B highway. He turned the car around and began the solitary trek home. Roughly 10 minutes into the drive, his headlights illuminated a chilling sight. Sitting dead in the center of the narrow, two-lane road was a parked car. Its hazard lights blinked in a slow, rhythmic, amber pulse. As he approached, he saw 2 figures standing in front of the vehicle, frantically waving their arms. Every self-preservation instinct the driver possessed screamed at him to press the accelerator and fly past them. The isolation of the road practically begged for a roadside ambush, but his conscience gnawed at him. He couldn't just abandon stranded motorists in the middle of the night. Against his better judgment, he slowed to a halt, keeping a safe distance of 20 feet between his bumper and the strangers. He cracked his window just a fraction of an inch, enough to hear, but too narrow for a hand to reach inside. The strangers were a middle-aged couple. Their presence somewhat eased his racing heart, but the moment the woman began to speak, a deep, primal unease washed over him. Her energy was manic, almost theatrical, but beneath the frantic gestures, her words felt mervinguum rehearsed, as if she were reading lines from a script. She breathlessly warned him that the main bridge, just a few miles ahead, had completely collapsed earlier that afternoon. She claimed they had nearly plunged their own vehicle into the churning river below. The husband quickly chimed in, pointing a trembling finger toward the dark woods. He told the driver about a hidden turnoff just a mile up the road. It was an unmarked dirt path that cut directly through the dense forest. He promised that while it would add significant time to the journey, it was the only way to bypass the destroyed bridge and safely reach the main highway. The driver thanked them, rolled up his window, and accelerated. As he drove away, a heavy, suffocating dread settled in the cabin of his car. Something about the encounter was deeply wrong. Why hadn't there been any road closure signs? Why were they parked in the middle of the street instead of on the shoulder? He decided to trust his gut. He was not going to take a detour into the pitch-black woods, based on the frantic advice of two phantoms. A mile later, his headlights caught the exact turn-off the husband had described. It was a paved wound in the tree line, barely wide enough for a single vehicle, instantly swallowed by the absolute darkness of the forest. The driver kept his foot on the gas and blew right past it. Minutes later, he arrived at the bridge. He slowed down, bracing for a barricade or a gaping chasm. The bridge was perfectly intact. There was no damage, no collapse, no police tape. He drove across the concrete span without a single issue and reached the highway safely. The driver made it home, but sleep evaded him. His mind raced with terrifying scenarios. What would have happened if he had turned his wheels onto that dark dirt path? Who was waiting in those woods? Days later, the agonizing curiosity overpowered his fear. He made a foolish decision. He got back into his car and drove out to that remote stretch of road. This time, the sun was high in the sky. The bright daylight stripped the landscape of its nocturnal menace, making him feel a little less insane for returning. He retraced his exact route. The middle-aged couple and their broken-down car were nowhere to be seen. When he reached the dirt turnoff, he slowed to a crawl and pulled onto the shoulder. His breath caught in his throat. Nailed crudely to the thick trunk of an oak tree at the very entrance of the path was a freshly painted wooden sign. It read, "Dead End." That sign had absolutely not been there the night of his drive. Even in the dark, his headlights would have illuminated the bright paint. Someone had hammered it into the wood within the last few days. He sat in the idling car, staring down the dirt path. In the daylight, it looked harmless, just a tight, overgrown trail. He turned off the engine and stepped out of the vehicle, intending to walk just a few yards and to see where it led. The moment his boots crunched on the gravel, a wave of profound, paralyzing dread slammed into him. The air felt heavy. The woods were utterly, unnaturally silent. Not a bird chirping, not a leaf rustling. The driver stood frozen at the threshold of the path, his body physically refusing to walk into the tree line. He decided to listen to his instincts. He pivoted on his heel, reaching for the door handle of his car. And then, the silence of the forest was violently shattered. From deep within the labyrinth of trees, echoing down that narrow dirt path, came a scream. It was a woman's voice, a shrill, agonizing shriek of pure, unadulterated terror. The driver didn't freeze. He didn't investigate. He threw himself into the driver's seat, slammed the car into drive, and tore away from the woods, his tires spitting gravel in his desperate flight. He never went back. He has no idea who the couple was, or what trap they were trying to spring. But the echo of that woman's scream still haunts his quietest moments. Tale 3. The Night Watchman. Our third story shifts from the vulnerability of the open road to the claustrophobic terror of being locked inside a massive, empty building. The narrator was 26 years old, earning a paycheck by working overnight security at a sprawling commercial warehouse complex. The hours were brutal, 11. 0 p.m. to 7. 0 a.m. He was the sole human being on the entire property. The facility was located in a desolate industrial park on the frozen fringe of a small city. The job was painfully monotonous. Clock in, walk the freezing exterior perimeter, retreat to the heated security office, stare at a wall of closed circuit monitors, repeat every hour until dawn. The warehouse stored bulk industrial supplies, nothing of extreme value, making the necessity of an overnight guard feel almost redundant. It was the dead of winter. A thick, silent snow was blanketing the industrial park, wrapping the complex in a muffled, freezing isolation. The guard completed his initial midnight patrol, finding all the exterior bay doors locked, tightened the property secure. He settled into his rolling chair in the office, sipping awful coffee. At 0 a.m., the digital chime of a motion alert pulled his eyes to the monitors. It was a camera pointing at the exterior loading docks. The guard leaned in, scanning the black and white feed. The dock was completely empty. Only the heavy, swirling snow danced through the floodlights. He chalked it up to the sensitive system reacting to the heavy weather. But the alerts didn't stop. Every 10 to 15 minutes, the system chimed. The same camera, over and over. Each time he checked, the dock was deserted. But a creeping unease began to take root in his chest. The motion on the screen always seemed to trigger right at the very edge of the camera's frame. A fleeting shadow, a glitch of pixels, as if something was purposely pacing just outside the lens's field of vision, teasing the sensor. By 2:30 am, he had received 7 alerts. No other cameras on the property were whipping. Right. 0 am, he decided to investigate. He zipped his parka, grabbed his heavy flashlight, and stepped out into the freezing night. The snowfall had slowed to a powder, and the industrial park was draped in a heavy, suffocating silence. He swept his flashlight beam across the loading docks. The massive steel-bayed oars were padlocked. More importantly, the snow covering the concrete dock was absolutely pristine. Aside from his own fresh boots, there wasn't a single footprint to be seen. No one had been out there. He retreated to the warmth of the office, deeply unnerved. 20 minutes later, the silence of the warehouse was violated. It was a harsh, agonizing sound. A loud, metallic screech, like something incredibly heavy was being dragged across the rock concrete floor. The noise originated from deep within the belly of the 80,000 square foot warehouse. The guard's blood ran cold. He frantically clicked through the interior camera feeds. Aisle 1, empty. Aisle 2, empty. Aisles 3, 4, and 5, all completely devoid of life. He desperately tried to rationalize the noise. Maybe the wind was causing the metal roof to flex. An arc rolled by an agonizing tension. Light. Then, the noise returned. This time, it was drastically louder. The metallic scrape was immediately followed by a violently loud bang, echoing like a sledgehammer striking one of the heavy steel interior doors. The guard's eyes darted to the monitors. Camera 6, the feed pointing toward the rear of the facility, was dead. The square screen was a block of deep black static. 3 agonizing seconds passed. The feed snapped back to life. But the image had changed. The angle of the camera was wrong. It had been physically shifted several degrees to the left. Someone, or something, had just reached up and manually twisted the lens. He had no choice. He was a security guard. He unholstered his radio, gripped his heavy flashlight like a club, and stepped out of the office and onto the sprawling warehouse floor. The interior was a cavernous labyrinth of towering industrial shelving. The overhead lights whirred, into a sickly, jaundiced yellow, leaving the deep recesses of the aisles drowning in absolute darkness. The guard walked slowly down the central artery of the warehouse, his boots barely making a sound on the concrete. He was roughly halfway through the massive space when he stopped dead in his tracks. To his left, echoing from 2 aisles over, came the unmistakable rhythm of human footsteps. Click, click, click. The guard froze. The moment he stopped walking, the footsteps in the dark parallel stopped instantly. He stood there, enveloped in a crushing silence, hardly daring to breathe. He waited for the phantom walker to make a move. The tension was paralyzing. Unable to bear the psychological torture any longer, the guard summoned every ounce of forced bravado he possessed. His voice echoed through the cavernous space. Security. I know you're in here. Come out with your hands visible. The silence that answered him was deafening. He spent the remainder of his patrol gripping his flashlight with white knuckles, clearing every single aisle, jumping at every shadow cast by the towering shelves. He braced for a violent ambush around every corner. He found absolutely nothing. The warehouse was completely empty. He retreated to the locked office and watched the monitors until the morning sun finally broke over the snowy horizon. When the facility manager arrived at 7:00 a.m., the guard reported the terrifying breach. A full maintenance sweep of the building was conducted. They found no first entry, no broken locks, no tampered alarms. The managers looked at the young guard with barely concealed skepticism, clearly believing he had fallen asleep and dreamed the entire ordeal. But he knows what he heard. He knows the camera moved. And he knows with absolute terrifying certainty that he was not alone in the dark that night. Tale 4. The Marathon. Our final story ventures into a place built for self-improvement and health, transformed by the night shift into a theater of surreal, visceral horror. The narrator had taken a gap year between high school and college. To pass the time and earn some cash, he picked up the graveyard shift at a local 24-hour gym. The facility operated on an automated, keycard entry system, meaning during the witching hours, he was entirely alone at the front desk. His responsibilities were minimal: monitor the cameras, wipe down the equipment, and occasionally chat with the nocturnal regulars. It was a rough neighborhood, but the clientele was generally respectful. On this particular night, the young employee was scheduled from 8:00 p.m. to 6:00 a.m. It was an agonizingly slow, deeply boring shift. By 2:00 a.m., the gym was practically deserted. He had finished his cleaning rounds and collapsed into the office chair, staring blearily at the grid of security monitors. A few familiar insomniacs trickled in and out, swiping their cards and hitting the weights. His eyes caught movement in the far corner of the cardio section. A man was on one of the treadmills. The employee didn't recognize him, which wasn't entirely unusual, but there was something immediately alarming about the man's behavior. He was running at an incredibly high speed. The employee pulled up the digital equipment dashboard on his computer. The man had the treadmill cranked to an aggressive 9 miles per hour. That alone was impressive. But what child the employee was the duration. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The man never slowed down. He never touched the controls. The employee leaned closer to the monitor, zooming in on the camera feed. The runner was a grotesque sight. He was dressed in filthy, ragged clothing. His long matted hair whipped wildly around his face. But the most terrifying detail was his expression. The man's face was completely paralyzed, a stone cold, emotional as his mask. He wasn't panting. He wasn't grimacing in exertion. He was simply staring dead ahead into the blank wall. The employee's eyes dropped to the running belt. What? The man was completely barefoot. He had been sprinting on the abrasive, textured belt of a treadmill at 9 miles an hour for over 15 minutes, with absolutely no footwear. The employee felt a knot of dread twist in his stomach. The man was now the only other living soul inside the massive building. Despite the fear clawing at his chest, the employee knew he had to enforce the facility's strict footwear policy. He used it as an excuse to confront the bizarre intruder. He stood up, walked out of the safety of the office, and navigated the labyrinth of weight machines toward the cardio corner. The treadmill was positioned just outside a narrow employee hallway. As the young man rounded the corner, his heart completely stopped. The back of the treadmill was painted in a thick, wet smear of crimson. The runner's bare feet were literally tearing themselves apart against the high-speed friction of the belt. Blood was not merely dripping. It was actively splattering against the plastic housing in the surrounding floor with every violent, agonizing footfall. Yet, the runner's face remained a mask of absolute apathy. He stared straight ahead into the void. His mouth was hinged wide open in a silent, unnatural gape. He looked completely detached from reality, numb to the horrific physical trauma he was inflicting upon his own body. The employee was paralyzed by a mixture of revulsion and sheer terror. Every instinct told him the man was deeply unstable and exceptionally dangerous, but he had to stop the machine. "Hey!" the employee yelled, his voice cracking over the loud, rhythmic thud of the bloody feet hitting the belt. "Stop the machine." The light. The man did not flinch. He didn't turn his head. He just kept sprinting, his mouth hanging open like a corpse. He looked. "Light. What are you doing?" "Stop." "Light." The employee screamed louder. Slowly, without breaking his sprint, the man spoke. His voice was a guttural, rasping whisper that somehow cut straight through the noise of the gym. It was the coldest sound the young man had ever heard. "Are you there?" He wasn't out of breath. He wasn't in pain. The employee yelled at him to stop again. The man simply repeated the chilling phrase, his voice devoid of humanity. "Are you there?" The pool of blood pooling at the base of the machine was expanding rapidly. The employee backed away slowly, terrified that sudden movement might trigger an attack. He turned and bolted back to the front office, desperate to call the police. He threw himself into the desk chair and grabbed the phone receiver. Before he dialed the emergency number, he cast a frantic glance at the security monitors to see if the man was pursuing him. The image on the screen made him drop the phone. The runner was no longer staring at the blank wall. He had turned his head. He was sprinting at 9 miles an hour, bleeding profusely, with his jaw unhinged, staring directly into the lens of the security camera. He was looking right at the employee. Suddenly, a blood-curdling sound erupted from the gym floor. It wasn't words. It was a primal, deafening shriek of pure, unadulterated madness. On the monitor, the man violently leapt off the moving treadmill, not bothering to hit the stop button, and sprinted out of the camera's view. The employee frantically clicked through the camera feeds, his hands shaking violently. "Wait area. Empty. Locker rooms empty. Lobby empty." The madman had vanished from the grid. There was only one camera left to check. The employee hallway. The young man clicked the feed. The bloody runner was standing perfectly still, less than 6 feet away from the closed door of the security office. The employee lunged out of his chair and threw the deadbolt on the office door just a fraction of a second before the heavy brass doorknob began to violently. "Right." The employee scrambled backward, punching 911 into his cell phone. Outside the thin wooden door, the man began to scream again. He threw his bloody weight against the frame, shaking the entire wall. The dispatcher's voice crackled in the employee's ear, promising that cruisers were 5 minutes away. The employee huddled in the farthest corner of the office, trapped in a cage of his own making, listening to the relentless, inhuman shrieking echoing through the door. The sound was so deep, so guttural, it barely registered as human. The assault on the door continued for 3 agonizing, endless minutes. The young man squeezed his eyes shut, certain the wood was going to splinter and give way to a monster. And then, just as suddenly as the madness began, it stopped. The screaming ceased. The doorknob went still. The employee slowly opened his eyes and checked the hallway monitor. The corridor was empty. He systematically checked every camera in the facility. The bleeding man was gone. When the police finally arrived, they had to coax the terrified employee out of the office. They conducted a massive, sweeping search of the gym and the surrounding perimeter. They found the blood-soaked treadmill. They found the crimson footprints leading into the hallway. But the runner had evaporated into the night. The young man handed over his keys, quit his job the very next morning, and has never set foot inside a 24-hour gym since. He still lies awake at night, staring at his ceiling, haunted by the rasping voice asking, "Are you there?" and wondering what horrific fate would have befallen him if he hadn't thrown that deadbolt in time. Thank you for joining us tonight. As you turn off your lights and drift off to sleep, spare a thought for the night shift. For the people sitting in lonely offices, staring out into the pitch-black woods, and watching the security monitors. Because out there, in the dark, you never truly know who is watching back. Stay safe, listeners, and keep your doors locked.